Well, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for staying for the Q&A, and thank you for joining us and engaging, and for all your questions. And before we get into the questions, I've got here with me Dr. Brian Miller and Dr. Rice Brooks. Thank you for joining us. And before I go into the questions, I have a question for the two of you, both of you doctors. How did you how did you become a Christian?
Dr. Miller, please go first. You're the physicist. Tell your journey.
Yeah, well, I grew up in a home where I believed in God, but I went to MIT undergraduate, and I read books like Richard Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker, and I became pretty convinced over time that belief in God was more of a superstition, that you either had to choose of being a person of science, where you look for truth, where you're objective, or a person of faith, where you just sort of accepted things because you were told them. And that was discouraging, because I said, if I'm simply an accident of nature, if there's no creator, then life really doesn't have much of a purpose. I'm just going to die and all my memories will be gone. And I remember just saying, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do exist, you have to prove it to me because I'm a scientist. And that put me on a rather long journey where I studied physics and chemistry and biology and history and a lot of different fields, just to ask the question, does God exist? And is the Christian faith true? And what happened over years of study is I realized that the scientific evidence for a creator is overwhelming. You see evidence of design in the structure of the laws of nature. You see evidence of design in the structure of our planet, our sun, our moon, the way everything fits together. And particularly, you see overwhelming design in life, in biology, in the origin of life, which is my specialty. And it was through that journey of looking at the evidence, not just the scientific evidence, but the historical evidence for the resurrection, that I intellectually came back to faith. And then I had different encounters where I saw answers to prayer, the supernatural, experiencing God's love in a real way. And it was that combination of the evidence and my encounter with God that fully brought me back to faith, realizing that Jesus really did die for my sins on the cross, and I've experienced his transformative power in my life over the years. So that's really what brought me back to faith.
Well, first of all, Carol, thank you for hosting this, and thank you for all of you that are joining us. I've been to Africa many, many times. I actually lived in North Africa, in Algeria, back in the day, as we say. My father worked there, so Africa has been in my heart from top to bottom. Spent many times in South Africa as a country. In fact, I went to South Africa, I believe, 6 times in 1 year, made 6 trips from the United States to South Africa. So it's an honor to be with you. My story is a little different than Dr. Miller's. I knew Jesus was real. I just rebelled against what I knew, didn't like Christians, did not like Christianity, did not see anyone that really I wanted to be like. It seemed like they were hypocrites, that this was a place you went to if you just kind of, didn't really want to try in life and just wanted to kind of say, well, I'm just going to ask God to kind of bless my life, and you don't really have any initiative or any kind of ambition. And it was an accounting class at my university that the top accounting student in my undergrad degree, he was sitting behind me talking about Jesus, and I turned and I just thought, what are you talking about? And it was a series of events like that where I saw individuals who were sincere about their Christian faith, and they seemed to be very credible. They weren't talking a lot of religious talk. They were excellent in what they did, and they were serious in their faith. And that led me to realize that Jesus is who I was told he was as a child, even though people have misrepresented him, even though I'd seen racism and seen all these different things that made me want to dismiss Christianity. It was the testimony of a few people, credible people, that really brought me to Christ. And that's where I always talk about my older brother who was in law school and came home to talk me out of my faith. And we baptized him that weekend that he came home to talk me out of my faith when he was in his 3rd year of law school in Dallas, Texas. And it was the same thing for him. He said, I had a lot of reasons to not believe in God. He said, but I know who you were, and I saw the difference in your life. So Dr. Miller's was more of an intellectual journey. I think mine was a journey of my own existential need for God and just needing to see someone who lived for God. And that's really what our hope is on this call is that no matter who you are, maybe you're just one person on your campus or somewhere else like that, where you say, well, I feel like I'm outnumbered. There's so many people that claim to be religious, but they don't really live for God. But really, it only takes one. And a scripture that really, burned itself into my mind was 2 Chronicles 16:9, where it basically says, in essence, the eyes of the Lord are roaming to and fro across the face of the earth, seeking those whose hearts are completely his, that he might strongly support them. And wherever you are, our prayer is that beyond just intellectual information, so to speak, or facts, that you become a person that says, I'm going to be that person. I'm going to be that woman or that man that's going to stand for Christ in my situation. So anyway, that was a long answer to a short question.
No, that's really great. Thank you so much for sharing to you both. It's really incredible. So let's get into the questions to see if we can help answer some of these questions. And when I say we, I mean the two of you, and I will just give you the questions. How does Hawkins' quote explain the first law of thermodynamics? That's Nicole asking.
How does Hawkins' quote on, because there's a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing? Dr. Miller, please.
And when you look at Hawking's statement about how a universe will come out of nothing if there's a law such as gravity, he's appealing to research that he did with Hartle, who's another cosmologist. And when you actually go back to the original research, what you find, and you dig into the mathematics, is that his research does not show that a universe comes out of nothing. His research actually shows, based on the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, that you have a universe that already exists. And then that universe, which already exists in a very small state, then can transition into the universe we see today. So what happens is there is no evidence that a universe could come out of nothing. His research simply shows that a universe that already exists can actually develop into the universe we like today. So another issue is what's called the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. And what happens is it's a very sophisticated mathematical theorem that shows that our universe actually had a beginning. And because our universe, everything began, time, space, matter, and energy, it still points to the idea that there's a creator outside of time and space that started it.
And I think just, when you ask, well, what does that have to do with the first law of thermodynamics? I mean, all the laws of physics, this is really the astounding thing is that the laws of nature came into existence as well. Space and time had a beginning, and those laws were exquisitely fine-tuned from the very beginning. But certainly the first and second law of thermodynamics would have come into existence. They themselves had a beginning. So they weren't, otherwise you just say, well, is the first law of thermodynamics the ultimate brute fact of the universe? Of course not. It just basically is in essence saying that matter can neither be created or destroyed, but that's once the universe comes into existence. Did I restate that right, Dr. Miller?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
It's great. Okay. Our next question is from Noku, and she's asking, is the Big Bang Theory true?
Yeah, so when you look at the Big Bang Theory, what happens is that simply stating that you have, if you go back in time, what happens is our universe appeared to start in a very, very small state. And then that universe expanded into the universe we have today. Now, there's different versions of the Big Bang Theory, and that's sort of the standard hot Big Bang Theory. And what happens is when you go back to the earliest moments of the universe, that's where the physics as we know it breaks down. And people don't fully know what happened at there. Perhaps there is an inflation phase where things really happen quickly. Perhaps you have to go to quantum cosmology. So there's a lot that's not known about the early stage, but the standard Big Bang model fits really well with the evidence, particularly the cosmic background radiation, the distribution of elements, and several other pieces of evidence.
Carol, I'm going to I'm going to step in and kind of guess what I think is behind the question. I hope this is okay. But when people ask that question, many times that's a Christian saying, or a person of faith saying, well, I've been fighting against science and saying the Big Bang is wrong because I believe in the Bible. And so for many years, Christians have been told that they have to ignore the science, that somehow that it's wrong. And so when somebody asks me, is the Big Bang true? I kind of read into that, and forgive me if this isn't you who asked the question, if this wasn't your motive. But if you're asking, how can the Bible be true and the Big Bang be true? Do I have to choose between the two? You don't. We have the book of nature and we have the book of scripture. And so when you read the book of scripture, it says there was a beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, period. That's a self-contained statement. And so the subsequent days of creation are separate from that opening statement that tells that the universe began and that God did it. And so when we look at science and say, wait a minute, science thought from Aristotle to Einstein that the universe was just eternal, that it was just there. And yet the Big Bang the science of the Big Bang pointed to this beginning of the universe. That's why in our presentation, we made the first point about how do you know God's not dead? Well, there was a beginning. And so whether the Big Bang is true, it's like, will there ever be another theory that maybe fine tunes that or gives greater clarity? Of course, because science is always learning and always growing. But it sure points to the fact that the science of the beginning of the universe is certainly not in conflict with the opening statement of the Bible that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So, and that's why, as we said in the seminar, many people didn't like the Big Bang itself. The phrase Big Bang was coined by an atheist named Fred Hoyle, who used the phrase Big Bang as a derogatory expression because he said, if you say the universe began, you're letting the divine foot in the door. So anyway,
right.
I'm going to I'll add some color commentary there as Brian gave the technical answer. I just wanted to give maybe more of a little background thought to that.
Right. That's really great. Thank you. The next question is from Moritz, and he's asking, or he or she, does the belief in young Earth versus the old Earth have any effect on the understanding and how we are supposed to understand Genesis, in brackets, the beginning in the Bible?
What happens with different Christians is you have some that wish to interpret the first days of Genesis, like Genesis 1-6, as literal 24-hour days. Other Christians feel that those days could be longer periods of time, perhaps over billions of years. So that's a fair conversation for Christians to have, and people of good heart have gone both ways. But it doesn't really affect the rest of the Christian faith, because what we all agree upon is that God created everything through his will. And the science points to that very clearly. Whether it was billions of years ago, whether it was 10,000 years ago, it doesn't affect the fact that we're created by God in his image, that humans rebelled against God, which resulted in the fall of humanity and the evil and suffering we see, and that Jesus came to die for our sins and to restore creation. So there's honest conversations about that topic, but it doesn't affect the overall story.
You know, Carol, there's about 50 verses in Genesis 1 and 2. If you take Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, 50 verses. So obviously when you're in those 50 verses, you have the beginning of the universe, the formation of the earth, you know, the light appearing. Many people conjectured that the earth was covered kind of in a shroud. And so day one, when God said, let there be light, that wasn't the creation. It's like light now begins to appear. Now, me and Dr. Miller, you may want to chime in if you think I'm not saying this the way you do. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But, you know, the fourth day, the sun was not created on the fourth day. The sun and the stars appeared from the earth perspective on the fourth day. And so the earth now begins to take shape. It says it was formless and void. Darkness was over the surface of the waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over those waters. And then God gives a sequence of statements, and God said, and God said. So it's obviously poetic. And God said, evening and morning, the first day, evening and morning, the second day. That's because in the Hebrew world, the day begins the evening before. Okay. And then, so it's sundown to sundown, so to speak. So I look at this 50 verses as telling a story in a very brief amount of time that tells a lot of things. But I take Genesis literally. I just don't take it literalistically. So I take Revelation literally, but I know that there's not, the dragon and the beast, that these are representative of things that this visionary statement in this book is describing. So same way, 50 verses in Genesis 1 and 2, you think about the volumes and volumes that could be written on science and physics and astrophysics, et cetera, biology. And so God's not trying to give us a physics and a biology course in just 50 mere verses, but he's giving us the pertinent information. Now, if you believe the earth is young, that is a entirely faith position. In other words, I don't believe there's any evidence that the earth is really young. There are those that try to chronicle what they think, different things of the young earth. And I say, look, first of all, I don't want to debate about that, because I don't believe when we stand before God as Christians, he's going to look at us and say, look, I got one question for you. How old did you think the universe was? Like, that's the big question of whether we get into heaven or how we live our lives. The question that really defines the Christian faith is the resurrection. That is the event that defines our Christian faith, belief in the resurrection, which is a mere 2,000 years ago compared to vast amounts of time, the resurrection being just 2,000 years ago. That's not even a blink in terms of the amounts of time that we consider when we talk about scientific evidence. But for the most part, without a few little things, the science basically says the universe is old. So if a person has a young earth belief, that's a strictly faith position. I'll put it to you this way, and Brian, you can confirm or deny this. I have never met, in 40 years of doing this, one unbeliever that believed that the universe and the earth was young. Now think about it. I've never met somebody who didn't believe in God or says they were not a Christian, that believed at the same time, hey, I'm an atheist, but I believe in a young earth. None. So what I say to believers is, I want to take the evidence that an unbeliever is looking at and say, can we see the evidence for the existence of God looking at the same amount of evidence? Okay, once they know that God is real, once they understand the resurrection is real, then all the other questions about Noah's flood or the age of the earth, we can talk about. But that's why we use the science, because Romans 1 says is that the nature and attributes of God, Romans chapter 1, can be clearly seen through what has been made. So even the Bible itself tells us that God's nature and attributes are clearly seen if you study the physical universe. And that's why in the seminar we say that if space and time began, then the cause of that would have to be spaceless and timeless, meaning that God, you can detect from nature that the creator is spaceless, timeless, uncaused, powerful, and ultimately personal. So that's confirming Romans chapter 1, that you can see the nature and attributes of God through studying what has been made. Any follow-up on that, Brian?
No, that was spoken very well.
Great. Nicole seems to be grappling with something here. She says, real faith, quoting, real faith isn't blind. I feel like I'm not wrapping my head around that well, and I don't know why. Do you guys want to comment on that?
Yeah, I use that expression because when I went to the Global Atheist Convention back in Melbourne, Australia, a few years ago, when I was writing the book, God's Not Dead, they kept referencing that people of faith have blind faith, meaning that they just don't have any evidence. And so when you have blind faith, you say, well, I have no evidence, and therefore my faith is just based on no evidence, nothing I can see or feel. It's just blind. I mean, it's just a leap of faith. And so when we say real faith isn't blind, what we're saying is that real faith is based on evidence. Okay? So we're given evidence, as Romans 1 again says, that the nature and attributes of God are clearly seen through what has been made. It says, so they are without excuse, speaking of unbelievers. There is enough evidence that's available that means is that you should have reason to believe. So we don't come to faith in God against our reason, but because of that reason. Okay? Now, interesting, in fact, the witnesses, when the apostles went out to declare the truth of the Christian faith in the New Testament times, they said, we are witnesses. We have seen things. 1 John chapter 1, not the Gospel of John, but in the small letter of John, he says, what we have seen with our eyes and handled concerning the word of life. And so Christian faith is based on evidence. Now, I was doing an event. Dr. Miller wasn't with me, but I had another physicist named Dr. Michael Gillen, who taught physics at Harvard, and he and Brian and I kind of take turns going out together like this. But we were in Poland, and I was on a television show, kind of their morning show. Like in America, we have Good Morning America. Well, this was like Good Morning Poland, and they said, you know, you're here in our country doing a seminar on the evidence for God, and the woman asking the question said, what about Thomas in the Bible? Wasn't Thomas told that he was rebuked because he wanted evidence? He wanted to, you know, put his fingers in the side of Jesus and touch the nail prints, and Jesus rebuked him. You know, blessed are those who have not seen and believed, meaning physically seeing Jesus alive before they could believe. And I laughed because I thought, here's a secular reporter asking a very theological question. But really, Thomas, you have to think about it. Thomas was an apostle who had seen so much, so many reasons to believe. And so it wasn't that Thomas was not to have evidence. Thomas had more than enough evidence. And at some point, you and I have to take not a leap of faith, but a step of faith. And we take the step of faith in the direction the evidence is leading. So it wasn't that Thomas was rebuked for wanting evidence. Jesus was basically saying, Thomas, in light of all that you've seen enough. Now you need to make a decision. I mean, I have 5 children, and I can't tell you how many times I've said to my children, I need you to trust me. Now, what I'm asking them to do is look behind you in your life and look at the evidence that I'm trustworthy. And I'm asking you to trust me now in what you don't understand based on my track record. And so we offer this seminar, and as Brian and I go to campuses around the world, we're offering you evidence, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to at some point say, I have to take a step of faith. I believe that God is real, Jesus is real, not a leap, but just a step.
Yeah, and I love the Thomas passage because I'm a Thomas. I'm a natural skeptic. I'm a scientist. And what's interesting about Thomas is he said, I will not believe unless I touch the wounds in his wrist and the wounds in his side. And Thomas was called the twin. So it's not surprising if he had, let's say, a twin brother, that he might have assumed people confused Jesus with somebody else. But what's interesting is when Jesus appeared to Thomas, he didn't rebuke Thomas. He didn't criticize him for asking for evidence, but he actually allowed him to touch the wound at his side and the wound in his wrist. And then Jesus said, stop doubting and believe. You've seen me. And what's fascinating in John 2 is if you look at after that part, John says, these signs are given such that you will believe. So again, what happens is the challenge is not a lack of evidence, it's the rebellion of the human heart. And Jesus said, whoever seeks will be shown, whoever knocks, the door will be open. So God has given enough evidence in creation that he exists, that there's a designer, and that people respond to that humbly and wish to serve him. God will give them whatever they need to believe, the historical evidence, supernatural encounter. But the first step is saying, I'm going to give my will to you, and then God will help us on that journey. So that's sort of that balance of how God gives us evidence. That faith is based on reason, but the challenge is the rebelliousness of our heart. And when we can serve God, he'll help us through our questions and our doubts.
That's really good. Here's a follow-up question, I think. Emma wants to know, if there's evidence for God, why are there so many people, especially scientists, possibly like you, Dr. Brian, who don't believe in God or in a God?
What happens is we are very, very shaped by culture. And there's been some really interesting psychological studies where people have found that, and they ask the person, which stick is the longest? And what happens is if there's like authorities around them who are all saying that short stick is really the longest stick, people actually say, I believe the short stick is the longest stick. So if you study the history of European culture with the Enlightenment, a lot of philosophers and academics said, we don't really want to look at the world as if God exists. So they constructed a view of reality where God is irrelevant, that we're simply here as a blind product of chance and time and accident. And what happens is there's enormous social pressure in the academy to believe that. So a lot of people will simply go along with it without thinking, without asking deep questions, because that's what's necessary for them to be accepted. What you find, though, is when people say, no, I'm just not going to accept what I'm being told, but I'm going to actually look at the evidence. Consistently, the evidence points people to a creator, the evidence from science, the evidence from history. But the challenge is if people are more concerned about truth than social acceptance, that's the barrier.
And, really, I think science defines the game, if you will, in a way that excludes the possibility from the beginning of being anything outside of the natural world. That's called naturalism or materialism. So if you say science is only going to look at natural phenomenon and natural processes, then to have something that points beyond nature, supernatural, metaphysical, it's almost like that's outside the boundaries of science. And so that's why when it comes to the science of things and believing, so scientists look at the material world. They look at this, they look at the empirical data, they repeat circumstances. Well, you can't repeat the Big Bang. You can't repeat the resurrection. You can't kill Jesus again and say, okay, go back and let's test this Jesus and see if you're really being raised from the dead, or is this just some kind of phenomenon because of the atmosphere in the Middle East or whatever. People have thought of the wildest things. So once you go beyond the physical world and you're now into metaphysics, you're really in a philosophical argument. And I think this is what we made the statement about is that science, I've got 2 books here. Science is not the foundation. Science rests on something else. Science rests on a philosophical foundation. I've got it upside down. Science rests on a philosophical foundation. And so once you begin to go beyond science, you're actually in a philosophical discussion. So scientists, whoever you are, whatever your occupation, once you begin to ask, does God exist? It's really not a scientific question. It's a philosophical question. And all of us have those philosophical questions. Now you can ignore them. You can say, pay no attention, there's nothing down there, but that doesn't make it go away. And so brilliant scientists like Stephen Hawking, when he said, because there's a law like gravity, the universe will create itself out of nothing. Well, he's a brilliant scientist, but that was a very, very poor philosophical statement that he made, violating, because there's a law like gravity, gravity is not nothing. So it's an absurdity there. So anyway.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to questions about evil. Quite a few of them. And the first one is, did God create evil?
Brian, I talked last, so you take this one. And
okay, what happens is God created people with free will. And they had a choice. People had the choice of either following God, trusting him, accepting the goodness he's demonstrated, or saying to themselves, I want to be like God myself. I want to decide for myself what's right and what's wrong. And that choice is what brought evil in the world. Evil is a consequence of people choosing to turn away from God and becoming gods themselves. And evil is really just a perversion and corruption of good. And what happens is, the question is, why did God give them that choice? Well, the question is, would you want to marry someone who is a robot, who is socially conditioned through shock treatment to love you? Or would you rather marry someone who chose to love you of their free will? So to have true relationship, there has to be freedom of choice. And that freedom of choice is what resulted in evil when people turned away from God.
Yeah, this of all the questions that we get around the world, and Brian, you and I have done this many, many countries and many, many times over the last decade, really. Most of the problems with believing in God come down to this. And so the first thing that I say to people, and I really want to know, is, are you asking a theoretical question, or have you been impacted in such a way that you're evil impacting your life or someone that you love or people that you care about? Has that made you think, well, if God is real, why would he allow this to happen? Now, when I lived in Israel, in studying there, you go into what was called Yad Vashem, which was the Holocaust Memorial. And you went into this place where they housed all of these remembrances and debris and suitcases and different things, pictures rather. I'm kind of thinking also of Auschwitz in Poland, where you go into the concentration camp and you see shoes and you see hair and you see all of the remains, the physical belongings of the millions of people that were destroyed there. And it's catastrophic. It's traumatic beyond words to describe that. But to the Jewish people who experience that, or maybe in different countries in Africa where you've seen genocide, or you've known someone from a country, you've seen evil leaders, and you say, how could God allow this? Well, I usually have to just stop and say, well, I want to hear your pain. I want to know what it is you're feeling, because whether you can figure it out mentally, you're still dealing with it emotionally and existentially. So, but on just a theoretical standpoint, Dr. Miller said it very accurately, that evil is not something. Evil is the absence of something. So light, or let's say, just put it this way, darkness is the absence of light. It's a privation. Cold is the absence of heat. And so evil is the absence of good. And so by creating good, if you look through, Genesis 1, as we just talked about, God began to say, this is good and this is good. It's a sequence of statements about what he created being good. And it's interesting. Now, when he said that, God saw let's say the trees or the animals and called it good, that wasn't a sense of goodness in the sense of, a good tree, meaning it's nice to its fellow trees, or a good squirrel or a good, animal is nice to its fellow animals. Good meaning that it fulfills its purpose. What is a good tree? Is a tree that functions in a good way. And then when it comes to mankind, and God sees it, the goodness of mankind, yet now we enter into a dimension of moral goodness. In morality is a choice. Evil is a choice. It's a wrong choice. So if you think about it, God is the one that defines evil. He tells us what it is. He denounces it. He says, don't do it. And ultimately, even when we do it across the world, mankind, humankind, everyone would acknowledge that no one's perfect. So when we fall short of moral goodness, then God himself becomes a man in Christ. He lives the life we should have lived, meaning that Jesus lived perfectly without evil. And that's why he dies the death that we should have died for evil, not just the big evil that the famous people of evil, the Hitlers of the world and others we think deserve, but it's for our evil, for my evil and for yours. And his resurrection verified that God accepted the sacrifice, that death could not hold him. And so God not only defines evil, telling us what it is, he tells us don't do it. We do it anyway, but he ultimately defeats it. And this is the power of Christianity, is that Christianity just doesn't come along and say, here are the rules, because we've known the rules. Every culture in the world knows that murdering somebody is wrong. They know that stealing and lying is basically wrong. The question is, how can we stop evil happening through us, not just to us? Everybody wants evil to stop happening to them. But the question is, what about it coming through me? So if God was going to get rid of all the evil in the world, it wouldn't just be the evil we don't like. Oh, well, I don't like this. We'll get rid of that. God would he starts with us. What about my selfishness? What about my pride? What about my lust? So God wants to get rid of all the evil in the world, but he does it not the way we think he should, just stopping it and controlling everything and making it impossible. He comes into our lives, forgives us, and then gives us the power over evil. So Christ giving us a new heart gives us the power over evil happening through us. And then that's why we preach the gospel, because the gospel is the ultimate antidote. It's the ultimate vaccine against evil, to come into our lives and to change us. And that's why people who claim to be religious but still live, and that's why we call them hypocrites, they don't allow the power of the Spirit to change them. That's why some of the strongest condemnations from Jesus came to those who were hypocrites, because it's false advertising of the power of the gospel to change evil at its very source, which is the human heart.
Yeah, so I mean, the rest of the questions on evil you've touched on. You've answered most of them, Dr. Rice.
I'm going to stop you. I'm going to throw it to you. Anything you'd like to add, because you said it would just be us, but I know you're a brilliant person. Anything that comes to your mind, because I want you to jump in on this too. Any thoughts that you have on that?
On evil?
Or yes, I mean, I want to give you a chance to comment. You're asking the questions, but I don't want you to not have the chance to comment, please, on anything, if this or anything else that's going on.
Yeah, I will comment, but I'm enjoying your answers.
Okay.
That's a good way.
Please take your liberty.
It's just a good way of escaping answering the questions. But here's a follow-up. Where is the loving God when millions are dying of COVID-19? Secondly, if we say the world is even and we attribute its creation to God, who, knowing the future, continued to create the universe as it is, then how is he different from the very evil we see?
Brian, I just talked a lot. You say something, then I'll come in behind you.
And
from Tunga.
And that is, again, as Dr. Brooks said, it's one of the most difficult questions. So we can't answer every detail. Yes. But we do know that as Christians, we do have hope, and we have sort of an outline of the truth. We understand basically what's going on. And the question is, why doesn't God intervene more? Why does he not prevent coronavirus or whatever? And again, what happens is we are experiencing the consequences of a world in decay. We're experiencing the consequences of a humanity that's rebelled against God. And the way God has chosen to restore creation is he's looking for people who want to have their relationship restored to him. People that will humble themselves before God and say, I have fallen, I've rebelled against you, forgive me, and help me to experience your love again. And what happens is when people encounter God, we become agents of transformation. I know both Dr. Brooks and I know a professor named James Tour, who's one of the top organic chemists in the world. And he turned his life to God, and God has given him supernatural revelation. He would say it's God's revelation beyond his own skills to come up with cures to disease. And he's developed these really clever nanomachines, which may eradicate a lot of disease. It may eradicate viruses like coronavirus. It may eradicate cancer. And that's the key, is that when we come to know God, we become an agent of transformation, an agent of healing, an agent of restoration. And it's simply a foreshadowing of the age to come. These are just foreshadowings of God's goodness, a picture of God's new creation. And what God eventually will do is at the day of judgment, he'll restore all of creation. He'll remove all of evil. But the challenge is, if God were to remove all of evil now, he'd have to kill all of us. So in his mercy, he is giving people time to turn back to him, allowing those people to give a kind of a foretaste of the new creation, and eventually he'll restore all of it. That's God's plan, and that's what we're seeing.
You know, first of all, the fact that you're on this Zoom call speaks a lot, that you are taking the time here on a Friday evening in Africa to listen to this. So I just thank you for that. I don't want to miss the bigger moment that here you are sitting on a Friday night. Of course, you say, well, I'm quarantined or whatever. I don't have a lot of places to go. But still, even when we weren't on quarantine, most of the campuses that we go to, especially here in America, the meeting like this will start at 7, ends at technically at 9 o'clock, 2 hours, and then students will stay till midnight asking questions. So I'm just wanting to tell you that if you're on this call right now, then there's something at work in your heart, either to understand something or to help others that you care about understand. And so when you really ponder these questions and you think about it, okay, why would God allow evil? Why would a loving God allow evil? I would restate the question. And that would be, and maybe even making a statement, not a question, that because God is love, he created the possibility for you and I to exist. Because if God was not going to allow evil to exist, then Rice Broocks could have never existed. Okay? Rice Broocks and the kind of, and he could have created me. Let me just make sure I'm clear on that. The kind of Rice Broocks that had real choices. My actions were very real. My decisions were real. We wouldn't even be having this discussion if God just created us, as Dr. Miller said, programmed as robots to do only good. So it's within knowing what good was, to know what good is, you automatically have to say, well, what's the opposite of that? So the legendary philosopher and writer C.S. Lewis, you may know him from the movies Chronicles of Narnia or the books. He said, I know that a line is crooked, a crooked line, but how would I know what a crooked line was unless I knew what a straight line was? So here we are in a world that we are now all alive in, and we know that there is such a thing as good and evil. And so what is even more of a problem than the problem of evil is the problem of good. Why is there so much good in the world? Why are there so many people? If we're just animals, if we're simply a product of evolution, and if you look at the animal world and you see the survival of the fittest, you know, when an animal kills another animal in the wild, in the wilderness, that's not a crime scene. That's just what animals do. So the question is, for every bit of virus or everything else that affects us, why are there people like us fighting for cures? And what is this about this mind and this reason and this whole logical ability to take something like the coronavirus, COVID-19, and in such a short period of time to be able to figure out a way to give vaccine? When you look back in history, you see the progress of science started because people believed that there was a God and that the universe was understandable. And if you think the universe is understandable and that disease is understandable, then using our mind and reason, we can deconstruct it and figure out the cure. So we're not just sitting here on a celestial couch, just staring at the universe. We are given minds and hearts and wills and creativity and desire. And so the whole human race, because we're made in the image of God, we are fighting evil because God put it in our heart to fight it. God had put it in our heart to not want it. And even when we see it in ourselves, we hate it. So this is why every one of you who cares about evil, that's because God put that knowledge of good and evil in your heart. And so I'm overwhelmed at the opportunity that God has given me to be an agent for good to come against evil. And I don't have to hurt people. I don't have to go out and do, war and hurt them to stop evil. Like Dr. Miller said, he could just kill everybody. But we have the gospel, which can go to the source of it, which is the human heart.
Yeah, it's really good. Thank you. The next question that I'm about to ask, I've had students ask me this question all the time, particularly in Africa and South Africa. For me, I've encountered this question in the past couple of years. And the question is Christianity a white man's religion?
Well, I'll start with that. Brian, you can add to this, but really, if you look at Christianity, I mean, Jesus was Jewish. So when I go to campuses in America, we have campuses here that are known as historically Black campuses, colleges, and universities, HBCUs. And people will say to me, was Jesus, or they'll say Jesus was Black, and I'll say, I know, because he wasn't white. And so if you say, well, and I'm trying to make a point that the white pictures of Jesus with the blue eyes, a lot of those pictures are painted in the Renaissance, painted in the Middle Ages. And so if you go to Israel and live among those people, you see the dark skin. And so of course Christianity is not a white man's religion, but it's not just a Black person or a Middle Eastern or Indian. He made all cultures, he made all ethnicities. And so people have used religion to further their prejudiced or racist ends. So I've worked in South Africa. I've seen how there have been religious doctrines that propped up apartheid in South Africa. People have used that against Jesus. They've said that they've tried to diminish the Jewishness of Jesus. And that's why painting him white or representing him as white was more of an anti-Semitic motivation, because if Jesus was Jewish, then what does that do to the racist people that are trying to use Christianity toward their racist ends? So when I'm, as a white person, as I go around the world, I can't tell you how many moments I've had to stand up, Carol, and say, sorry, it's me. But Jesus loves white people. But out of the 7 billion people in the world, if you reduce 7 billion down to 7, you would have 1 Black person, 1 white person, a lot of Asians, especially Chinese. God must love the Chinese because he made more of them than anybody else. Indians from India and all in Latin America. So the world that Jesus died for God so loved the world. It wasn't just white people or Black people or this people. He died for every ethnicity. And that's why in heaven, it says, I heard a sound of every tribe, every tongue, every people, and every nation. And that's why, Carol, you and I work together, and Brian, we work in a ministry called Every Nation. We're in 82 nations that we work in. I've been personally to 40, but it's really an exciting thing to see how Christianity is exploding throughout Africa. It's explosive in India and in Asia. Some of the largest churches in the world are in Asia or in Africa. So, that is a product of painfully mistaken missionary activity, especially to the continent of Africa, by white people propagating myth, racist religion propagating myth, but it's not the faith that the New Testament teaches.
That's right. I have to agree with that. Dr. Brian Miller, do you want to add?
Oh, well, I'll expand it a little bit. That was really beautiful. What Dr. Brooks said is that gets into a bigger issue of hypocrisy in the church. Like, a lot of people don't like Christianity because someone who claimed to be a follower of Jesus did something that hurt them. And that could be individual, it could be a group of Christians. And that is really hard, and it should really hurt all of us. But Jesus sort of said that would be the case. He said that the gospel is a seed that's being put out to everyone. And what happens is sometimes the seed falls on bad soil. So many people are very excited about Christianity at first, but because of the cares and worries of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, deception, it doesn't do much in their life, and they don't represent good models of what it could be. The other challenge is that God loves us and will accept us even when we're imperfect, even when we're idiots. And I've hurt people being an idiot. And that's sad. But the beauty is that God's mercy transforms us year from year. And as time goes on, we become more consistent with what Jesus taught. And that's the beauty. So the key issue is not to look at other Christians as a perfect picture of who Jesus is and what he taught. It's to look at Jesus and to become a person who says, I'm going to be the good soil. I'm going to fully give my life to God, so then I will be a witness for Christ of what his kingdom is and not a detriment.
Carol, just on a personal note, I'm a pastor of a church. We have a pastoral team, and I serve here in Nashville. And I began pastoring in the year 2000. And when I took over this church, it was a few hundred people, mostly white people. And so this has been written in a book. I didn't write it, but it's been chronicled. I stood up on the third Sunday here in Nashville, and I said, I'm here to tell you that I'm not going to pastor a white church. We're in a city with 100 nations. And so I had some people leave that were there, that exposed their motives, but more people came. In fact, we grew from a few hundred people to 3,000 people in about 3 years. And now there's 60 nations in our church. And when people come into our church, they're pretty stunned. In fact, there's the head of the School of World Missions, Greg Okeson, Okkason. He wrote a book called A Public Missiology. He's the Dean of Missions at Asbury Seminary. Well, it got the Christian Book of the Year in its category this past year. And in chapter 9, he details Bethel World Outreach Church, our church, and tells this story. And he interviewed different people. And it's when people come into our church and they see the nations, and we have several locations. And then as the senior pastor, I turned the ministry over to an African-American named James Lowe. And so our partnership and him having real empowerment has made a statement in this state. And that's not just us. There are churches all around America that are kingdom churches. They're there in Africa the same way. And so there'll always be the churches that have people that have, the same, I heard a story years ago about a man of color trying to get into an all-white church, and they wouldn't let him in. This was back in the 1950s. And he went out on the corner when the ushers wouldn't let him in, and he began to cry. And he looked up to God and he said, "Oh God, why? And the Lord spoke to him and said, look, I've been trying to get in there for 100 years. They won't let me in." So, churches that are like that do not have Jesus in there. That's you become racist. As Jesus said, if you're my disciple, you love one another. And he told most of those stories about love, about loving people of other ethnicities, especially Samaritans. And so really, this is where we have a chance as believers to love one another, to love people of other ethnicities, to love people from other cultures. And that demonstrates the reality of Jesus in our midst.
Yeah, this reminds me of a book by Dr. Rice Brooks that I read, Every Nation in Our Generation. I think it's there. I've read so many of these books, but I think it's in that book where one of your sons turned to you, like you walked into a black church and one of your sons turned to you and looked at you, is like, "Dad, are we black?"
Yeah, what happened is that I was that was in my house years ago, and my son was about 4. And because our church was so diverse, I heard him ask my wife a question, and I heard her say, I didn't hear his question, but I heard my wife say, "You're going to have to ask your father." And so Wyatt, my son, came up to me and said, "Dad, are we black?" And I thought what's funny is that my wife wasn't sure, but it's because he was looking around and seeing so many cultures. Now, the funny thing is that my wife actually took a DNA test, and she's 1.5% sub-Saharan African. So technically he does have,
I'm black in him.
So the answer was legitimately yes.
I knew it. I knew you were black, Dr. Rice Brooks. Moving on, Kumbulani asked this question: if God exists, which God is he? Is he a Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Rasta, Zoroastrian, Baha'i God? How do we know which one he is? And why is he not any of the other? Why is he not any of the others? And
What's interesting is, well, God created us with the need to know our creator. So it's the human instinct for people to reach up to God. And what happened initially is when people rebelled against God, the fall, there is that separation that took place between us and God. And people were still reaching up. And what happened is they would often look to nature to get an idea of who God was and what he was like. And what happens is people would get a sense of what God is like, and some things were true and some things were not true. And what happened is we weren't the ones that had to get to God, but God came to us. So Jesus came to earth so that we could see a full picture, a true picture of who God really is. That was the whole point. So Jesus came to earth, reflected his character, his nature, his truth. And before God had revealed himself to people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And what happened was people now have a choice to experience the real God, the God that's revealed himself to us, or they can experience the God that they partially create in their own mind. And what happens is all of us have a tendency to recreate God according to our own desires. And we all have to have the choice. And this is Christians too. So Christians have the choice of experiencing the true God or a God of their own creation. So all of us have to say, God, I can't know you by myself. You have to reveal yourself to me. And we come to know Jesus, we see who God really is. So there is a lot of truth in a lot of different religions, but there's also ideas that are false in a lot of religions and ideas that are false in Christianity. So all of us have to go to Jesus to see who God really is. And that's beautiful because Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the greatest promise of all religions, because all religions want to know who God is. All religions want to know truth. So Jesus is the savior, not just of Christians, but of all people, of all perspectives. And we all have to choose, are we going to embrace the truth of our own perspective, our own desires, or somebody else's desire, or the truth that God has revealed to us?
You know, Carol, Brian is a much more accomplished mathematician than me. I made a B in calculus, and he is a physicist with a great pedigree of mathematical background. But I did enough math that the teacher would always ask us to show our work. You didn't just write in an answer, because when you see someone's work and then you see their answer, you see that there's a lot of things they got right, but then the answer's wrong. And I think that's what Dr. Miller's saying when he said there's truth in other religions. Let's say if you take Judaism, well, of course, Christianity came out of Judaism, which means that the Old Testament was the background and the prelude to what we now have in the New Testament. So when you look at Judaism, you can see the evidence, the truth that they talked about, but yet the answer was not Moses. The answer was not just the 10 Commandments. The answer was a savior who would have been the fulfillment of what Moses looked for, of what Isaiah the prophet and others would have looked for and foretold. If you look at Islam, Muhammad died 632. He was, by his own, testimony, illiterate, and heard a voice in a cave, an angel speaking to him as he alleges. And so if you read the Quran, which I have, you see many things that are borrowed from the Bible, but there was a lot of mistakes in it because the way the Quran was written, and I'm not trying to be disparaging, just looking at the facts. For instance, in Surah 4, that's chapter 4, I think it's verse or ayah 157, it says Jesus was neither killed nor crucified. So in Islam, you have a statement in the Quran that can be verified, true or false, historically. And so we know that Jesus died. That's a fact of history. If you did not have a Bible, you could know a few things. Number one, you could know that Jesus was executed by Pontius Pilate on a Roman cross. That's a fact of history. That's not a biblical fact. That's an historical fact. Okay. Number two, that his tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. That's a fact of history. If you did not have a Bible, history points to the empty tomb. Another fact you can find from history is that Christianity started early It started just a few days in the very place where it would have been easiest to disprove. And so there are facts of history that show that Islam got that wrong, that Jesus is indeed, was crucified, not the Quran saying not. Then you go to Hinduism with millions of gods. You go to Buddhism, which basically says that you and I really don't exist, that our existence is an illusion. And so you begin to eliminate different things that you see are wrong. I sat on an airplane. I've flown over 3 million miles to these 40 countries. And I met a lot of people on airplanes, Carol. Well, I met a person on an airplane that told me, a woman that said, I am God. Now I looked at her and I said, if you're God, I've got a lot of questions for you. So within that short bit of conversation with this woman claiming to be God, I came to a very logical conclusion that she was not God. And so if you really work to say, I want to know who this God is, you don't just want the correct answer. Okay, Rice or Brian, tell me the right answer to write in. If you just do a little bit of work, you'll realize that not only does God exist, but that Jesus Christ of Nazareth was this eternal God in human form who really lived in history. It's a person of history, really did miracles, really died on a cross. And 3 days later, his body was gone from the tomb. So Christianity, Carol, is based on an historical event. In fact, the Bible itself, 1 Corinthians 15 says, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then our faith is in vain. No other religion puts the weight of its validity on one event. Islam doesn't do it, Hindu. There's no religion that says, well, if this one thing is wrong, then our whole religion is wrong. But Christianity says, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then this is wrong. It's falsified, which is a pattern in science by a man named Karl Popper, famously talked about falsification, that if you can't prove something wrong, then it really can't be, investigated. But Christianity is falsifiable. If the resurrection, which happened in history, did not happen, then it's wrong. Now, I have another little answer to this. Is I have a friend, we both do, named J. Warner Wallace, who's a crime detective, and he goes and solves what are called cold case murders, which if somebody's been murdered, then the case is never closed. And they go back, they don't usually have direct evidence, Carol. They have indirect evidence and circumstantial evidence. And so the death of Jesus happened in history, and you can investigate, historical investigation can take place without any necessarily direct witness, even though we have the witnesses in the Gospels. But you can go back and look historically and see that the evidence points to the resurrection. So I say I forgot the name of the questioner. Who asked that question?
Yes, you've answered the question, but this leads us to the next question because we've mentioned the Bible.
No, I'm just asking who was the questioner? When?
Tunga. No, it was Kumbulani.
Okay, Kumbulani. So Kumbulani, I would just say that what makes Christianity the one to trust is not Christianity as a religion, but Jesus as a savior. Christianity just is a name of a religious belief, so to speak. But I say to people, I put the weight of my trust. I'm sitting in a chair and I'm putting the weight of my body onto this chair. I put the weight of my trust in Jesus Christ and him raised from the dead. And you had a follow-up. I just wanted to make sure I made that clear.
Yeah. So Helga actually asked this question, which is a follow-up. You spoke about the Bible. How authentic are the scriptures in the Bible? Her question is, how can we trust the Bible to be true? And then before the follow-up, Nkosi asked a question, a follow-up is, why did God choose such a corruptible way to share the truth that is in the written form? So it's all about the Bible.
Yeah, I'll say this, and Brian, you can chime in at the end. The communication that we have in terms of human communication in the Bible, it's funny that they use the word corruptible, because God didn't just send a book, he sent himself. He came as an incorruptible person. In other words, Jesus was called the Word. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then it says, that's John chapter 1, then it says, and the Word became flesh. And so Jesus didn't just, cause a bunch of Bibles to come down and, like dropping literature over a war zone. He comes himself. And so we have the incorruptible communication. Now, humans who saw that had to tell that story. So yes, the potential, it's like the potential for sin exists, the potential for corruption existed. But let me use a little acronym, SHARPER, sharper. And I take that from the New Testament, where in Hebrews 4:12, it says the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. And so the S, when somebody asks me, why do I believe the Bible's true? I remember that acronym. Number one, S, it stands for the same. In other words, the question is asked, is what we have now what they wrote then? And the answer is yes. How do you know that? Well, you can just take the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in around 1948. Those scrolls gave us in Israel, in the Qumran area, and I've been there many times, it gave us a look of over 1,000 years earlier from the earliest manuscripts we had. So in the 1940s, Carol, we had manuscripts like this. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, it gave us a 1,000 year earlier look so we could see how much it had changed.
Yeah.
And it was virtually the same. So number one, S is the same. Number two, H is historically accurate. In other words, the places in the Bible are literally there. So again, I studied and worked in Israel. No one in Israel denies that Jesus existed. And if you take your Bible, I remember the ambassador from Israel to the United States a few years ago was named Daniel Ayalon. He was the Israeli ambassador to the United States. He's been right here in this home. He's spoken in my church. And he said, come to Israel. He said, you don't need a map. He said, just bring your Bible. It's historically accurate. A in sharper is archaeologically verified. I sat with archaeologists, Carol, on the very place in Jerusalem where they discovered David's house, in Hebrew, Ir David. And I met with the archaeologists that dug down through hundreds of years of trash and debris where the city was buried. It's all over Israel. You don't have, and these people aren't necessarily believers. They're just archaeologists who were uncovering the reality from the Golan Heights in the north to the Negev in the south, all across from Hebron, in Galilee. I mean, there it is. I've got a friend that has a water park on the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee and all of the surroundings, it's archaeologically verified. The R is reliable manuscripts. In other words, we have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts. Okay, we have 10,000 Latin manuscripts. So now think about it. People say, oh, in the Bible like this, that people whispered and go, and it's like the game of where they whisper and then you tell somebody something and they tell somebody and they say, isn't that what the Bible was? Is it people just kind of told these stories? No, it wasn't that. The Bible was like a text game or an email chain. If you go into a court of law, they're going to look at all the text that you've sent and all the emails. Well, we have all of the text, most of those 5,000 Greek manuscripts. I'm friends with the man that leads up the whole project that's helped in recent times, because it's been a long chain of people, named Dan Wallace, that we have the text. We can see. And that's why it's called textual criticism, where if you're sitting in the class, Carol, and you have 100 students, and somebody on the overhead or projects an image on the screen, and everybody has to copy a letter. 100 students are copying a letter on the screen. And what if you lost that original? Could you reconstruct the original from the 100 copies? And that's what that's what we get our Bibles at. They have all of these manuscripts, and it's called textual criticism. They can comb all the manuscripts and say, just like you could say from the 100 copies in a classroom of the original, could we reconstruct it to 99.9% being verified? And what we have today, The manuscript evidence is overwhelming. P, so same, historically accurate, archaeologically verified, we're spelling sharper. R, if I'm spelling right, reliable manuscripts. The P is prophecy. They're prophecies of things that were told hundreds of years before that came to pass. Just read Isaiah 53, verifiably spoken 600 years before Christ, and look at it speaking about Jesus. The E in sharper is extraordinary impact, the impact on lives. And then the final R is the resurrection. Because Jesus has been raised from the dead and he believed the scriptures were true, then I'm putting my trust in him as the ultimate authority. So that's why I say the scriptures are true. That's a long answer, but they need that.
Yeah, that's really good. I've copied everything you just said. The next question is, I'm going to ask you, Dr. Brian. We have so many questions and so little time. We're just going to have to do this again. How many DNA codon pairs exist in the simplest single cell organism? There may be billions of pairs in our genome, but the issue is how big was the leap from organic material to life?
That's a great question. What happens this is what's really interesting, is if you look at different approaches to studying what's called the minimal genome, that's the smallest amount of information that's necessary in a cell. And there's multiple approaches. Some look at modern cells and they keep taking away genes until they don't work. Some try to construct a cell from the bottom up through theoretical models. Some work in the middle and look at things like the different transcription factors and so forth. Now, if you look at all of that research, what you'll find is the smallest imaginable cell that could exist would be around 1 million bits of information. That would be like the Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. That's the minimal amount of information that's needed in order for a cell to exist. Now, what's really interesting is you can combine that research with studies of self-replicating machines. Like, what's the simplest self-replicating machine you could create? That's like NASA with space probes. That's like robots. And when you look at those two lines of research, they converge. So we know the simplest possible cell had to have information processing. It had to have error correction. It had to have energy production. It had to have selective gateways to allow certain things out and certain things in. It had to have waste disposal. So what you're finding is the simplest possible cell is, again, like 1 million bits of information. And the challenges with the origin of life is that as soon as you go from simple chemicals to anything even remotely like a cell, every physical process is trying to break that thing apart and turn it back into simple chemicals. So just the machinery necessary to prevent the thermodynamics from breaking it apart would be like 100 different proteins. So it's clear is the origin of life had to happen in an instant, and the amount of information that was infused into that chemical system had to be at least 1 million bits of information.
Wow. Okay, and I've got the next question. Looking at nature, there are some species that give birth to their young, after which they die. Examples are salmon or some spider species. Given this, how do we know that God did not create the universe and then perished? So tempted to answer that. I'm just kidding.
I'm sorry, could you say that last part again? God didn't create the universe and then...
So given this, how do we know that God did not create the universe and then perished and then died?
Oh, I see. Right. Well, God is obviously very, very different from a salmon, because if you look at the idea of our universe, if you keep going back, you have to ask what started everything. And that something that started everything has to be eternal. It has to be immaterial. It has to be infinitely powerful to create a universe. So whatever is the originator of everything has to be eternal. And that eternal starter was God, because we see in the laws of physics, we see in the nature of life, we see that a mind preceded matter, because everything shows information, everything shows purpose and intentionality. So that's how we know God had to be eternal, because whatever started everything had to be the source of everything else.
I mean, just think of just practical, and my analogies may not be as precise and as profound as Dr. Miller's, but imagine how long life would exist on Earth without the sun. It's like, well, the sun was certainly a component in just, photosynthesis, and all that our world is sustained by the sun. Imagine that sun disappearing, and a few minutes later, depending on how, the 96 million miles away or whatever the distance is. How far is the sun miles? Is that about it, Dr.
Yeah,
Melvin?
that's at 96 million miles. That's about right.
Okay, so really, it would be synonymous with saying the creator disappears, and then it would be an instantaneous, we would be gone, because in him we live and move and have our being. He sustains all things by the word of his power. So, and the evidence points to that there is an interactive deity, an interactive being that not only created us, but is still communicating. He's still speaking. He created the universe and then became man in Christ. So the miracles of Jesus show that God did not create the world and then die or then disappear like a salmon. Jesus' resurrection, it says God raised Jesus from the dead. So Jesus would say, when they asked him about his miracles, he said, it's my Father in me who does the works. So Jesus, again, I go back to Jesus. Jesus's very existence, his miracles and his resurrection point to the fact that God's not dead, which just so happens to be the theme of our seminar. God's not dead.
Yeah. That's good. Lester wants to know, what are your thoughts about the Higgs boson and how the work at CERN, CERN, adds to the observation of Hubble?
Right. So what happens is CERN is simply an accelerator, a linear accelerator they use to smash atoms together to determine what's called high energy physics or particle physics. And what happened is you have what's called the standard model of particle physics. And that just sort of explains everything from quarks to electrons. It sort of fits all the particles together. And the Higgs boson was a theoretical particle based on the standard model of particle physics. So at CERN, they found evidence that the Higgs boson actually exists, which is what justifies that basic model. And that's really key, because if you look at the standard model of particle physics, you look at quantum mechanics, what you see is the laws of nature were incredibly well designed to allow for life. Because if the laws were even slightly different, if the constants were different, if the mathematical structure were different, nothing would exist of significance. So again, it all points to a creator.
Thank you.
It's Carol, and again, my layman's definition, it's like, just because I know how to break down an iPhone and I found the components that make the iPhone work doesn't mean that Steve Jobs never existed. So we confuse mechanism with agency. We can break down a car engine and we say, I understand how it works. That doesn't mean you did not need Henry Ford to make it or create it. So we confuse philosophically these categories. So if you find in the Higgs boson, I believe they used to refer to it, Lederman, I remember reading a book years ago in the 90s called The God Particle. And at that time, they had not found the Higgs boson. Is that accurate, Brian?
Yes.
This is when they called it the God particle, meaning that if we find this missing piece, it's kind of like Thanos in the Avengers when he had the infinity
rings.
He needed one more infinity stone in there. And once he found that, well, once you found the Higgs boson, that did not mean that God was not needed. It just meant like understanding how a phone works or how any other component works. So we're not afraid to discover down to the infinite detail how something works. But just because we know how something works, the mechanism, doesn't mean the agency that created it and designed it did not exist.
Right. So we've got to take our last question, but we have so many more questions.
Let me say this, Carol. Let me say this. Let me butt in. I would love to do this again. And sometimes what happens, Carol, is that this becomes a thing where people like word of mouth. And I'm in Nashville. Dr. Miller is in Seattle. And he has better, speaking of fish, he has better fish to eat than I have here. But we would love to do this. And so you can just decide if you have a lot of questions and the word kind of spreads. Yeah. We can replay this online. And Brian and I, this is a joy to be here. I wish I could see everybody. I wish I could hear those questions from those people asking them themselves, because I like to see people's faces and and interact with them. So please don't, I'm serious. Brian and I will be available sooner rather than later.
For campus directors, you all heard Dr. Brian Miller and Rice Brooks say that they'll do it again. So fear not. And everybody who's asked questions, we will do this again so that we can get to most of the questions that we didn't get to. But the final question is from Miriro, who is asking, do you think we can ever get to a place where we as humans have all the answers concerning God? If we knew it all, would we still need for him in our life? We would still have a need for him in our lives.
You go first, Brian.
Well, first of all, obviously, we will never know everything there is to know about God. So our brain would have to be the size of the universe, and even that wouldn't be sufficient. But even if we did have perfect technical knowledge of God, that would be insufficient. You could have perfect technical knowledge of your parents. You could know everything about them or your spouse. But there's a very different thing about knowing about a person and knowing a person, being in a relationship with them. And that's what's key, is the heart of the Christian faith is that we don't just know certain truths about God, but we know him personally. He in various ways speaks in our life. He shows us his love and compassion. And that's what's key, because the fall wasn't simply a sense of people having false knowledge about God. The fall is people having a broken relationship with God. And it's the restoration of that relationship which brings true salvation.
You know, that's such a great question, because we think we know somebody. I talk all the time and I say, oh, so-and-so is my friend. So-and-so is my good friend. So-and-so is my real good friend, you know. So we have different levels of friendship based on how much we know about that person. And I could think of the best friend I have in life, which is my wife. We've been married 38 years. And I'm still learning about her, because I can know what she likes to eat, but I don't know everything she's eaten. I know what she likes to wear, but I don't know everything she's worn. So depending on how long you've lived, there's that much more to know. Now, there are certain things. So imagine an infinite, eternal being, how much you would have to be eternal yourself in that same capacity to have the capacity to even know what he possibly knows. But one last thing about knowledge, because, and this is why knowing God is not, God's not a, I'll go back to my phone. God's not like a corpse we put down and we can kind of operate on and dissect like a frog. We can know certain things about God from just observation. But there's other things in the vast majority that we have to know by revelation, meaning that he has to speak to us. So I'll borrow this analogy from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis would say, if you go into my kitchen and you see a water kettle, a pot boiling, science can tell you at what temperature water boils, and they can tell you about the metal in or the aluminum, whatever. But science can't tell you why that water's boiling. And he says, somebody has to tell you why they're boiling it. And Lewis would say, it's because I'm going to make a cup of tea. And so that's where the relational aspect of knowing is. See, the ultimate reality of the universe is not material things we break down and study like a Higgs boson. The ultimate reality in the universe is a personal being, is consciously personal and wants to know you. And so when science, I like what John Goddard, not John Goddard, it was Robert Jastrow. I remember this, one of the first books I read. He was the head of the Goddard Institute at NASA, and he was an agnostic. And he wrote a book years ago called God and the Astronomers. And he said, I have to talk about God based on what's happening in astrophysics and astronomy. And at the very end of the book, I'll never forget it, remembered it from the first time I read it. He said, when the final group of scientists scale the final mountain of uncertainty, he said they will probably find a group of theologians sitting on top of that mountain that had been sitting there waiting on them for centuries. In other words, at the ultimate basis of the universe is not some powerful force that we break down scientifically, but a person that we can know. And that's what he's offering every person here, a chance to be in fellowship and to know the Creator through his son, Jesus.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rice Brooks, Dr. Brian Miller, thank you for this great Q&A that we've just had. I think also thank you for the presentation that is so well packaged that we can get to understand concepts that are sometimes very difficult to understand. And I'm looking forward to us doing this again. To everyone watching on the screen, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for staying for this whole time, for engaging, for asking the questions. And if you still have more questions, please go to godsnotdead.com and send your questions there or interact with us there, and we'll be able to get to you and interact with you.
One last thing, Carol, I'm butting in again. I want to say
Yes.
to everybody that every nation, people like Carol and these Every Nation campus directors are superstars. I know them. They are smart. They are spiritual. I mean, if I was in Africa, I would want to seek out an Every Nation campus minister and be their best friend, because they pray, they're sincere. If they don't know the answer, it's like Carol. Carol says, if I need some help, I'll go. She has friends like us that just like if I needed something she knew, I could get Carol here, and I do say, Carol, I need your help on this situation. Well, we're here to help you to not just join our group. It's not just about our group. It's really about coming to know Jesus. But the Every Nation workers and those fellowships of people are incredible. So thank you, Every Nation staff and all those who are part of Every Nation. They are the real deal. So it's a joy to be here with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rice. Thank you, Dr. Brian Miller. Thank you, everybody. You can enjoy the rest of your evening or good night.